Okay. Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us for this live webinar for the Builders AI Forum on why the church may be key to saving civilization. My name is Benjamin Crockett and I'm the Director of Content at Longbeard, and it is my great privilege and honor to moderate this important conversation on one of the topics that I think is most important in the world right now. So with these esteemed speakers who need no introduction, Father Michael, Matthew, Alessandro, thank you for being with us today for this important conversation. And so today's topic of discussion is on AI and the risks that we have for our civilization. As AI becomes a dominant force shaping global systems, we begin to wonder, is civilization really at risk? And so for all of you watching online, this is a live conversation, and I want to invite all of you to participate, to share your questions in the comments. We're keeping track, and about halfway through this conversation, which is going to last roughly an hour, we'll open it up to your conversation. So please join us. So let's get right into it. Let's begin with the problem. Why is civilization at risk? People say that AI is going to destroy the world. Just a few years ago, in 2023, there was an important letter that was signed by 30,000 of the most important AI researchers, thought leaders, leaders in this industry, saying we need a 6-month pause. Now we know what happened. There was no pause. We kept plowing ahead, but they were so afraid. Now, afraid of what? Matthew, I want to begin with you. What are the risks?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, but I think there's probably, we can classify them into two categories. One would be the risk that AI becomes self-aware or something, and then, or doesn't. It just becomes super intelligent and gives given access to the, too many tools and doesn't use them the way we want them to, and ends up destroying humanity, either because it feels it's in some kind of war for scarcity, for resources, or it just doesn't like us. I suppose that's one thing that kind of fuels our nightmares. The other would be just the risk that with all the major disruptions that are going to be brought about because of AI and robotics basically coming in, disrupting the job market, there could be this very visceral reaction from people about these technologies, and this could be actually destabilizing to civilization. So it's not so much AI itself ending the world, but we end it just by fighting amongst ourselves in reaction to these technologies.
Mm. And Father, what do you see when you talk to your flock, your faithful who come to church and they're worried? They're worried about the jobs that they might not have, their children growing up in a society where they might be replaceable or not needed. What do you feel are those risks, those very spiritual risks that you feel when you speak with your flock?
I work primarily in the world of education. I'm a university professor at different institutions, Regina Apostolorum, the Angelicum, Catholic Tech. And so I'm constantly working with students and also parents of students. And the big question is, what am I being trained for? What will I be able to do? What will I be able to contribute to society 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And I think that there's a great anxiety because of the uncertainty, the real possibility that so many jobs today will be further automated, or that only a small minority of the absolute elite will be able to work in a particular field. Now, this is a real risk, but it's also an opportunity, because I've been hearing more conversations, just listening to a conversation in New York Times about how to rethink education. And so many different figures are coming back to the importance of forming people in transferable skills. We would speak in terms of virtues, of capacities to adapt to new situations. There's a lot of talk of a revival of the liberal arts, of being able to pursue activities that are intrinsically meaningful. There's a lot of talk of critical thinking skills. So we might be able to enhance our productivity tremendously, which can be a great thing, but we'll still need those essential critical thinking skills to discern illusion from reality, to navigate all of the pitfalls of misinformation or disinformation that continues to spread. So I think that this is a great opportunity for the church, which has long been an advocate of the liberal arts and long been an advocate of forming the whole person, to really equip people today to continue the learning process and to adjust to all of the situations that right now are to some degree unforeseeable.
And Alessandro, you work with you're co-founder of Hallow that, has used modern technology to help people to deepen their spiritual life, to encourage prayer, to encourage that avenue into, the church community. Some might even say that you've used AI and modern technology to kind of, encourage that in a way when spirituality is oftentimes seen as the foundation for civilization. Could we say that you and the Hallow team have used AI to, in a way, bring back civilization, to keep it growing?
I don't know that I'd claim anything so grand as to help civilization at that scale. I think we try on our daily basis to try and help people grow a little bit closer to God and putting His will at the center of their lives by developing or deepening a relationship with Him and helping them grow in the tools and the habits of discernment to discern His will. We certainly have used AI in some applications, both internally and more recently externally with some of our users through some great partners, including Magisterium AI. I think one of the things we've learned, certainly about the spiritual life, and then also the interaction between how technology can be kind of in service of spiritual growth, as opposed to kind of opposed to it or destroying it, are a few things. I think there's a deep difference between knowledge and wisdom, first of all. And so, those are distinct and separate gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so while knowledge does play an important part of our search for truth, we have faith and reason, of course, are the two wings upon which we ascend to truth. Contemplation is fundamentally the tool that we aim at in terms of discerning God's will in our own mental prayer lives, and then ultimately, in the sacraments and the Eucharist. What we have found is as people develop that journey or progress through that journey, there's often an intense desire as they fall in love with the person of Christ to know more about Him, to know about the church. And so there's this interesting relationship between, what we might use in our work in education and evangelization of heart knowledge versus head knowledge, right? And the relationship between those two things. I have a great bishop friend who often says that we have to remember that our fundamental why as a church is a who, not a what. And so that's the foundation. But as we get to know the who of Christ, how we navigate our lives on a daily basis to discern His will, to know more deeply, to contemplate the objective truth of the world, does take a lot of what's. And so we've seen, for example, as people pray more, they tend to want to learn more about the church. And so tools like AI, as Father Michael was alluding to in the area of education, can actually be quite impactful, scalable way for people to have that virtuous relationship between growing head knowledge and heart knowledge in a way that ultimately progresses us all towards sainthood. So I'm sure we can talk about a bunch of specifics, but that's kind of some of the thoughts we've had so far.
Alessandro won't say it, but I'll say it. How is a great means to save civilization. Powerful.
All glory and praise be to God. We hopefully don't lead people in the wrong direction. I'll say that.
I do want to say too, we open up and we talk about how the possible ways that AI could doom civilization, right? But I think it's also important to acknowledge that that's a view shared by some, 40%, a good chunk of AI engineers, for instance, as you kind of alluded to, Ben. But not everyone agrees with that. I mean, like Jan LeCun, who's the head of Meta's AI lab, thinks that's nonsense. Thinks that the Quest AGI is not going to destroy civilization. It'll be built in the open, and we'll have time to kind of mitigate the downsides, and it'll likely accelerate flourishing in really profound ways. I mean, Elon Musk thinks there's at least an 80% chance that it leads to an era of superabundance. So I want to be clear about that. Not everyone agrees that this technology necessarily is going to result in either pitchforks in the streets or AI just launching that Terminator scenario where the nukes just leave the silos. We have a lot to do with that, right? And what the eventuality is going to be, and which is why I think all of us, there's a role for us to play in ensuring in this new AI and robotics age that we end up at an era of superabundance, a golden age, as opposed to destroying civilization.
And Matthew, with that, what are activities, what are people doing that are inspiring you in terms of pushing back when we speak of these risks, when we speak of people who feel like they're growing up with no hope for their children, when they feel that the distraction economy is sucking everyone in, and we're kind of losing our spiritual life. What are activities? What are people doing concretely for the faithful Catholics out there watching? What are steps that we can do, and who are leaders that we can identify with and push forward to arrive at that area of superabundance?
Well, I mean, if you were to ask me, what do I think is the key to saving civilization? I think it's the Catholic Church. It's evangelization. I think is the key. Being successful in our evangelization mission. So, any of the definitive leaders in that space, I think, are playing a vital role. I think Hallow is one of them. I mean, Gordon Fire, Bishop Barron's been doing incredible work in the media. There's a whole list of people that I could list, and I think that ultimately it comes down to. I do think that there's been a generation or two who've been raised consuming media, which is really focusing on a kind of a post-apocalyptic view of the future. It almost feels like inevitable that we're going to ruin it all. So if that's the case, why would I bother, investing in my future, or preparing for my future, or supporting others, right? And I think that represents a real poverty in our age. I think of it, and I use this example all the time of Star Trek: Next Generation. The generation that grew up watching that show, which had a very positive view of the future, right, where humanity had evolved beyond greed and racism and things like that. And I think that inspired a lot of people, right, to think humanity, we can do this, right? We can figure this out. That's a vision of the world that's positive, and now let's work backwards and figure out how we get there. And I think that's something that's going to be key to civilization, is the church kind of stepping in and being kind of a beacon of hope in the world, sharing a vision where humanity and AI and robots can live harmoniously, and obviously human flourishing is the objective function, as we say now. That's the objective. I think if the church can help us get it clear about what human beings ultimately need to flourish, then I think ultimately will be more effective at actually ensuring that the decisions we make about how we use AI technologies will actually lead to that brighter future and not ruin everything.
And Father Michael, I'd like to jump to you. What is the church's vision for AI and robotics?
Well, the church has a lot of insights on how to guide the development of emerging technologies. And I think that fundamentally, the technology should always be at the service of the person. So there's this notion of person-centered design. These are marvelous tools that can facilitate a lot of the acts and procedures that we need to perform in our life. They could potentially create a period of, as Matthew described, of greater abundance, even a sort of superabundance. But it's very important also from the perspective of the church to appreciate that there's not only an objective meaning of work, but also a subjective meaning. This is something that Pope St. John Paul II highlighted very well. He wrote a whole encyclical on the meaning of work called Laborem Exercens, which has become a surprisingly relevant document decades later. And this is also a man, a priest, who, as a young man, was formed in working in the mines and doing hard manual labor growing up. And he became increasingly convinced of the lessons to be learned, not just through the products that we make, but through the very process of work. And so if we do achieve this kind of superabundance period, it's important that we step back and appreciate how our activities can still contribute tremendously to developing our God-given talents. The church also has a very strong view that each and every one of us have an intrinsic dignity, and each and every one of us have a personal vocation, a unique mission. We're all different parts of the mystical body. So we might be a flexed bicep that catches a lot of attention, or we might be a little pinky toe hidden away, but we're still an essential part of the mystical body, and we have a role to play. So if we enter into this period of superabundance, a lot of people who have been told the lie that their value depends primarily on their utility in the market, they're going to really enter into a crisis. But the church, thankfully, has reminded us in the past industrial revolutions and throughout history that our meaning and our contribution to society goes beyond a kind of economic utility metric that we might like to use. And so perhaps this is a great opportunity for the church to help people recover the sense of authentic leisure, to perform acts that are just good to do, whether or not they're part of your 9-to-5 job. Worship, of course, is a primary example of this. It's Josef Pieper, the great 20th century philosopher theologian, wrote a whole book on leisure as the basis of culture. And we can speak of 100 examples of concrete practices of leisure, but for Pieper, it's fundamentally a receptivity to reality. And so in worship, there's a special receptivity, a contemplation of ultimate reality. And it's not a private act, it's an act performed in community. So how good it is that already as a church, we train people to come together despite their differences, different backgrounds, different social levels, and so forth. And there's this exchange of gifts. And we get a little glimpse of that, maybe an hour each week. But how good it would be if, as a church, we guide people to allow that 1 hour to spill over to their entire life, so that their other social activities, so that the art they make, the music they sing, the different projects that they pursue, the way they care for one another is really inspired by that kind of contemplative spirit, that receptivity to reality. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area, but thankfully we as a church have a rich patrimony. We've been thinking about this, we've been implementing it for a long time. And so I agree that we should really be a leader in this phase of teaching authentic leisure, teaching people how to use their time well, and teaching them the deeper meaning and value of their lives.
That's fantastic, Father. And just to jump in here, so we're getting a lot of comments on the live stream, and I just want to share one. So there's a discussion going on. This points to the technology and the kind of the transformative aspect of it. We have currently 50 live people watching. We have literally tens and tens of comments coming in, and one of the questions is technology neutral? Alessandro, with the Hallow app, with mobile phones, they're connected to us all the time. They know us in some ways better than we know ourselves. Do you believe that technology is neutral? I mean, is this something that is just a tool, as we're seeing in the comments, or is it something that's fundamentally transformative, something that kind of has a moral nature because it's impacting us and changing our relationships and getting in between everything in some senses?
Only big questions here in this exchange. Yeah, I mean, I certainly have a I suppose biased interest in saying that the technology certainly can be used for good. I think one of the key, I guess, short answer is it depends, right? I originally started my formal education and early career in economics, so economists always have two hands. On the one hand, there's this. On the other hand, there's that. I think there's a sense in which technology is neutral, and there's a sense in which technology is slightly less neutral, points towards a specific end. I think one of the salient points that came out of the original Builders AI Forum in Rome last year was that various people in the church, including Pope Francis, pointed towards there is an inherent teleology in much of technology. Things that are built by humans are endued by their creator with certain teleological ends, in the same way that we, by being virtue of being built by God in the image of God, can intuit and learn things about God and about ourselves by contemplating our physical reality. So there's a sense in which the way in which phones are designed or specific pieces of software technology point towards a greater teleological truth. I think at the same time, there's a way in which technology can be viewed as neutral, in that they are as physical or pseudo-physical things, potential, right? These things don't act in the same way that only the will can act. And so it's by the application of the will that brings about the potential of the things, to kind of use some scholastic Aquinas there, that brings about the reality that furthers the advancement of our soul. So certainly you could use a hammer to build a house, or you could use it to go and murder someone, for example. I think there's two areas of formation there that we often think of. The example that we use pretty frequently is, nobody needs an app to pray, right? Prayer happens in the silence of our own hearts and in relationship with God. In a similar way, no one needs a gym membership or a personal trainer or equipment to be physically fit. You could certainly go running or just simply eat well and do exercises at home. However, when we realize that there are areas of growth in ourselves that would benefit from additional accountability or learning, whether that's relational or self-guided, there are ways in which we can orient things that are fundamentally tools and towards a greater good in relationship to our use of them. And so we try and think about a human-centric, Father Michael referenced human-centric design, what are the goods that are ends of themselves in our own human lives or in the lives of humans we serve, that we can intentionally design or apply a certain teleology to a certain set of tools. So we try and do that with the phone or the computer, for example. Certainly a million ways you could use them for wrong, but we try and kind of rewire our relationship with technology to sanctify as opposed to distract or destroy. And so that's kind of maybe redeeming or rewiring, to use a little bit of a pun, some of the inherent teleology that could exist in tools separately. I would also make a second point around Father Michael's observation on sometimes we, I think, can paint this world of the good AI outcome is the superabundance, the bad AI outcome is the, everybody's dead, or they tries and kills us. I think there's a way in which that makes some intuitive sense, but I think there's a little bit of a malicious assumption that can sneak in there, is that so long as we have more stuff or more freedom in a generic worldly sense, more cans, without the right oughts, or without the formational training on how to discern what is good, not just what is possible, the superabundance world could actually be a little harder to deal with and require the church even more to deal with that formation opportunity, as opposed to the doomsday scenario. I think that it has been more intuitive to us humans, I think, since the cross, to turn towards God and our greater objective realities in the face of suffering and conflict. And so I think that is something that applies to our comfort that technology brings. And so I think whenever we start to get into areas of significant amounts of comfort or high leverage economic activity, we can kind of slip into those kind of more pernicious assumptions around, because one can do more doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to lead us towards the right natural answers without the right formation. So
that's for sure.
Two different things there. And
I think it's important to note the Pope had said AI in particular, he didn't feel it was neutral, right? So I think we can just acknowledge that. Pope Francis, kind of famously said that. But that's, principles, because AI, right, at least to date, has been trained predominantly on human data, which human data is not neutral, right? It represents all kinds of biases. So depending upon the distribution of the data, those biases can lean one way or the other, and the AI is going to basically, parrot that back for the most part, as they're basically pattern matching machines. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And so AI in some ways is different than, let's say, like, the way a hammer, right, or a sword are neutral. Well, that all really comes down to the intent, right? The hammer was designed and built to hammer nails, right? So construction. So in principle, it's not neutral. It's built for a specific purpose. And you could say the sword is basically designed to kill other human beings. So it's not really neutral, and since it's designed, it's fit for purpose, right? So I think in the same way, when we're training AI, we have to think of it like that, right? And what is the particular problem that we're trying to solve with AI technologies? And I think the interesting about this whole industry is the industry was kind of emerged because we all wanted, to find ways to kind of offload to machines and give them more and more capabilities so they could kind of like handle more and more for us. There wasn't like really a specific intent or problem that we're trying to solve. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're having a bit of a problem, right? There's all kinds of innumerable problems that AI is being brought to bear to solve. Some of them are good, some of them aren't so good. So I think this is why, like, being very intentional, and Alessandro was talking about it, I think superabundance sounds really good, but superabundance, I mean, just because there's abundant resources doesn't mean that we're going to be happier. We know that already, right? So not having a good understanding of what humanity is all about, what civilization is all about, is really important. And this is why the church has a really important role to play in this, clarifying what is the purpose of human beings. What is the purpose of the universe? What is the purpose of the civilizations that we create? If we can get clear on that, then we can make sure that the AI is aligned to achieving those ends. But if we don't get clear on that, we just let people continue to innovate. There's no telling where that technology is going to be directed. That ultimately actually may end up impeding flourishing instead of accelerating it.
Yeah, I really appreciate Alessandro's point there. And I certainly think that without the guidance of the church and other friendly institutions, we run the real risk that any sort of abundance or superabundance that emerges will be the occasion of greater indulgence, greater distraction, greater dissipation of energy and time. And we can imagine all sorts of ways in which people can squander the amazing opportunities, because, as Matthew noted, we know historically, with all of the great technological developments that have come since the Industrial Revolution and all of the new comforts and advances in medication, in medicine and healthcare and so forth, there are plenty of rich, miserable people out there. There are plenty of people who have all of the necessary material conditions to pursue the higher things, but choose not to for one reason or another, very often due to lack of formation. And so, not judging the hearts of anyone, but I think objectively we can see plenty of people are squandering the amazing opportunities that they have now, living lives that would have seemed like a dream to most members of the royalty in just a few decades or centuries ago. So yeah, there's quite a bit of work to go forward. And I think also Alessandro and Matthew are highlighting this point that somewhere between the sort of major doom and major boom, we'll probably find ourselves in a situation in which many people will leverage the technology, but many other people will squander opportunities and may choose to sort of entertain themselves or fall into an ever greater digital absorption and might be distracted from these deeper pursuits. And it's really the church is very much necessary in challenging, in calling people to a kind of repentance, to a greater self-giving. I would say even a technological asceticism, right? We have a long tradition of training the faithful in knowing how to enjoy the goods of the earth without indulging in them. And so just as I set aside the delights of certain foods or drinks during the Lenten season, during Advent, we occasionally need to learn certain practices and skills in a kind of analog setting to train those particular muscles, if you will, or those capacities. A lot of authors speak of the ongoing problem of de-skilling, where we sort of outsource important human behaviors to different AI systems. And it's precisely there where we begin to weaken in our capacity for discernment. We begin to struggle more in evaluating evidence and in distinguishing false claims, false information from truth. We lose the ability to structure arguments if we lean too heavily on AI-assisted writing. So all of these tools can very quickly become crutches. And of course, we don't want that. So I think the church needs to speak of this kind of digital asceticism, not to shun the technology, but precisely so that we can use it with greater strength and wisdom.
Yeah, and I think it's so important with the existential cliff that's coming. I mean, let's face it, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be out of work, at least in the short to medium term, because of these technologies, and they're going to be left wondering, well, now what do I do with my life, right? And if they lack good formation, right? If they haven't been effectively evangelized, then they may turn to things like VR worlds, right, or gaming worlds, and just chase dopamine hits right off a cliff. And I think that tragically, I think for a lot of people, that's probably where they're headed, and that really deeply disturbs me. Right? I mean, the fact that these people would choose these things, these facsimiles of joy and peace, because they don't know about the latter. They don't know about what the church has to offer. So to me, I think this should be a very personal mission for all of us, that we have to become more effective at evangelization. We have to find ways to reach out to people and meet them where they're at and invite them to the faith, because if we don't, they could end up drifting, and so I think, like, now that we have these tools like AI available to us, which are really powerful ways to communicate truth and knowledge. And I think it's important to keep in mind, Magisterium is just an A example, but Magisterium when it's basically passing information on to a user, it's just simply distilling what the church has said, what human beings have said. It's simply just basically combining it in a unique way to distill it, right? And so in some ways there is an opportunity here with AI to ensure that the patrimony of the church comes to touch people's lives and helps point them in the right direction. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have to embrace it, because there'll be a lot of people. This is how, unfortunately, that they're interacting with human beings and how they're interacting with the world is through devices, is through AI technologies. So we have to find a way to meet them where they're at. And again, I think it all really comes down to the church has to be successful in our evangelization mission. We have to take it personally.
And Matthew, if you were, if you had the opportunity to speak to, Pope Leo the 14th, for example, who has addressed, AI as a core priority, he spoke about it in the opening days of his pontificate. What roadmap would you set? And then Father Michael and Alessandro as well, I'd like to ask you this kind of final question before I turn it over to the audience, where we have lots of questions coming up. But what practical roadmap can the church, start to take now as this becomes more and more clearly, a problem? And there is that existential cliff, as you've spoken of, Matthew.
Well, I think there's a real risk that the church decides that it wants to kind of step in and that in going beyond ethics, it starts feeling it has to give some advice on regulation, and it just gets pulled into this like regulatory advisory role. And I think that obviously that needs to happen, because the church has a lot of insight that needs to share, and I think they really need to hear from the church there. But I personally, I think what's more important, the deeper poverty that I'd like to see addressed by this pontificate is just helping people to hope, right? Reminding people about what life's about. What have we learned through our history about the right ways to live, how to live in right relationships with one another and with ourselves, how to worship. I think if we can get clear about what that actually looks like on a tangible level, then people will start to desire it. And I think this is the big problem. Like, we're asking people to give up, VR worlds and gaming. Give it up for what? Like, we have to be able to sell an alternative, which is meaningful and rewarding. And if we don't sell it effectively, people aren't going to choose it. So that's one thing I'm hoping that we can get better at. Maybe technology is a component that can be used, but we have to be clear about what humanity is all about, what God wants for us, and we have to find a way to more effectively sell it. And I think if we do that, that will lead to a lot of souls being saved.
Beautiful. And Father Michael, if I may turn to you with this question. I mean, I know also a particular area of study that you've addressed a lot is, of course, the AI, AI entering these relationships and being something that sometimes replaces people. I know that's one of the civilizational problems, because of course relationships are the building blocks of community. But if you had the opportunity to speak to someone like Pope Leo, or someone within the Vatican, where you can really address this issue and make AI be a top priority, what roadmap would you push for?
Well, I think, like everyone on this call, we're very eager for the blessed opportunity to speak with the Pope, and I think that we would continue to address some of these issues you already mentioned, right? The centrality of relationships in our life and really in our flourishing. I think precisely because we see the widespread use of AI systems for kind of artificial intimacy, we're reminded of our call to communion. We're made in the image not of a solitary God, but of God who is perfect communion, the eternal exchange of interpersonal love. And that plays out in a very real and concrete way in our families, in our friendships, in our parishes, in our universities, and all the other great associations we have. And we ought to live out our identity as really the most inclusive and supportive institution in the world. And I say this not because we're great, but because the Lord himself has founded this mystical body. He's founded this great communion of life and love in the church. And through this gift, if we're really faithful to our call, then any person who is in the least tempted to substitute human relationships for digital ones will be able to find a friend or a support, someone willing to listen to them, someone willing to affirm, and then also, of course, challenge them, but challenge them out of love and with real accompaniment, patiently bearing with them any of their weaknesses, their faults, their failings, any of their awkwardness or their messiness, because the Lord bears with that in us. And we found in the church and in different communities that kind of support, that kind of challenge, that kind of growth that we most need. So I see the tragic examples of heartache and suffering and absorption and misery that certain forms of artificial intimacy are bringing to people. I see that as a reminder, a sign of the times, and a reminder that we really are made for communion and that we crave it, we long for it. And if we're not finding it elsewhere, we're going to settle for these sad substitutes. But as Matthew pointed out, the more that we have authentic interpersonal relationships through the church and all of its different institutions, the less attractive those alternatives will be, and we'll be better able to address what many outside of the church are calling a sort of loneliness epidemic that's leading to mental health problems of anxiety, depression, other forms of distress, but also even physical ailments in terms of cardiovascular disease and premature death. So we see even in our bodies this call to communion. And I'm excited about the role that the church can continue to take on in helping people meet this fundamental need. But of course, I would want the Pope and all people of goodwill to be well aware that this artificial intimacy is no longer the thing of science fiction. This is a widespread reality that is negatively affecting millions upon millions of people's lives. And Mark Zuckerberg is already speaking publicly about how he thinks AI companions will supplement the lack of friends that so many people are reporting. So we have major influential figures already approaching AI companionship as a kind of solution or a way of mitigating this loneliness epidemic, when in fact we ought to be called to be better friends ourselves rather than outsource that.
Beautiful. And I'd like just to turn now to a few questions that we have from the audience. So there's
Ben, can I add on to that just a little bit? Yeah, I think after Matthew and Father Michael give Pope Leo all the right answers, the only thing that
oh my goodness.
The other thing I would add on is I'm one of my personal core beliefs is that the greatest tool for evangelization is the life of joy. I think we saw that in the early church, where there was so much of what you heard about the church was either in secret or very publicly in martyrs, and it was the joyful martyrdom of the early church that I think led to the explosion of the Christian faith, to embrace a reality that clearly transcends the look and feel of the here and now. I think in a world that is so much dominated, to Father Michael's point around deaths of despair, I mean, to give an obvious counterexample to why the superabundant future is not sufficient in and of itself is that Matthew and I have talked about this before, but calories are more ubiquitous and cheaper now than ever. High quality entertainment is now cheaper and more ubiquitous than it ever has been, and we are more lonely and dying more deaths of despair and addiction dependency than ever before. I think the key that is missing there, that I'm sure we would all agree with, is a full understanding of what it means to be human and the deeply relational reality that comes with that, both in community in the body of Christ, but also in connection with the head of the church as Christ. And so if I had to distill that into a kind of roadmap or core philosophies, I say, how can we as the church truly live out a deep understanding and competency with the world, but one that demonstrates an obvious better alternative that leads to joy? I think when people, particularly those that are deeply hungry for relationship, for meaning, for purpose, for orientation in the world, when they see people that have it, they think, okay, what does that person believe? What are they doing? I want some of that. Right? Lead with the solution, and people will follow the beliefs that come from it. I do think competency is an important part of that. I think for much of the church's tradition, the world's leading scientists and intellectuals were all deeply Catholic and embraced both the pursuit of truth in its many scientific and technological means. We see that in Laborum Exertions that Father Michael brought up, Holy Back to Rerum Novarum. It's not a detachment from caring about those truths or participating in the exploration of those truths. It's understanding them, being highly competent, but in the deepest way possible, and understand how they fit into true freedom and the life of virtue. I think if we can be like people like Matthew and Father Michael are, leading the conversation, being experts, applying the technologies, the ideas of artificial intelligence and other things in a way that demonstrates we really actually do understand this and know this, but in even a deeper way than someone who's maybe at a secular institution without that broader framing of objective reality. I think that's how we engage most effectively. In the same way, Pope Benedict XVI famously created the first papal Twitter account, and although he was not a Twitter user, he observed that from the very beginning of the early church, Paul went out and spread the message. What were the tools that he used? He obviously wrote letters, but he also traveled the Roman roads that were built originally to conquer and subjugate the Roman Empire, but then also became the tools for salvation through their authentic tying with and carrying of the gospel. And so I think it's fully embracing with confidence, with understanding, with the fullness of the truth.
Oh, beautiful, Alessandro. And so I'd just like to now go to a few questions from our audience. There was an enormous discussion that developed a few minutes ago, or 15 minutes ago, on the incentive models of the major AI companies and the business models. And essentially, there were two communities that were commenting, and one was essentially very, very pessimistic, saying essentially that the economic models, the incentive models, mean that the people leading these companies don't care, and that this is going to spiral out, and that we'll have essentially a negative form of AGI. Matthew, Alessandro, I'd like to ask both of you, when you see the incentive models of these companies and the way that they're working, and they're working at full speed ahead, do you have faith, confidence that the right security measures are being put in place, that they do, more or less have those guardrails? Or is this something that the general public should be genuinely afraid of?
The public should be generally afraid that there's not enough guardrails in place. I mean, the heads of the AI labs would concede this point. Dario Amodei, the head of Anthropic, and Demis Hassabis, the head of DeepMind, which are two of the most biggest labs in the world, really at the cutting edge, have both stated that publicly, that they wish that there was more kind of international regulation and governance around this issue. So, I think yes, we need this, and I think the problem is right now is a lot of this, the impetus for governance and stuff is coming from the top down, which isn't great for all kinds of complicated reasons. I think it needs to be coming from both bottom up and top down, and there isn't a lot of bottom up coming because really I think there's still a lot of ignorance around where the technology is actually at, and how soon it's gonna effectively disrupt the world. So I would like to see, really, all of us, we laity, kind of step up and try and facilitate a much more robust conversation about first educating us, everyone, where this technology is at and how it's going to likely impact the world, and how do we feel about that, and what do we want to do about it, and then encourage our politicians to make it more of a priority. That would be certainly a healthy step in the right direction. And I think in that way we can have more of a dialogue with the regulators about what kind of regulations we want to see in place, because it's also important that we listen to, I wouldn't say the regulators, but the politicians. They're dealing with some very complex, strategic issues. China right now and the United States are in a race to get to artificial general intelligence, and the person who gets there first is going to have enormous military and financial advantages over the other side. And so, how comfortable are we living in a world where Chinese AI is basically powering 80% of AI in the world, and basically controlling a large chunk of the world's population's information diet? I think we all should be collectively a little, concerned about that. And so we don't want to necessarily lose, which means we don't want to hamper our own AI companies too much. But at the same time, there has to be at least a robust conversation about this. In the end, people need to give a license to this approach. And I think that's one of the things that concerns me the most, is we never kind of voted on this. It's just kind of been something that's kind of happened. It's emerged, and then all of a sudden we realize we are in this geopolitical conflict over in a race to get to AGI, and now it's all full steam ahead, and safety is kind of taking a back seat. So I think again, if we're just racing to get to AGI for the sake of getting to AGI because we just recognize there's financial benefits to it, I think this could very likely run off the rails and cause a lot of collateral damage, which is very unfortunate. This is why I think it's so important that the church clarify for human beings what humanity is really about, so we can just say, well, is achieving AGI really going to help us accelerate flourishing in really meaningful ways, or is it going to help expand GDP, which obviously could benefit us to some extent, but that's not what civilization's about. And so, I think this is something that if we had a more robust conversation, if the church was pushing for this, because I don't know where a frank conversation on these technologies is going to come from. The AI labs obviously are limited in what they could say because they have shareholders, and our governments tend to be distracted by a whole bunch of other issues and tend to think in 4-year cycles. So the church, having shepherded humanity through multiple transitions along these lines, and having the deepest understanding of the human condition, I think has to step up and lead in this area.
And Matthew, if I can ask a follow-up question for our audience who might not be keeping track of this every day, where are we in your best guess in terms of arriving at AGI? And what do you see concretely the leading Western AI labs doing to ensure that there are guardrails that make it? Because I understand, and I think our audience understands very, very clearly what's at stake. And we frankly would not want to be living in a world where where the Chinese Communist Party was calling all the shots on this. But where is your best guess for our audience?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends how you define artificial general intelligence. I tend to ascribe to Demis Haspas's definition. Which, if you think of the human brain as kind of like a Turing machine, which is named after Alan Turing, the father of computing, in principle, a Turing machine, as understood by Alan Turing, would basically be something that's capable of computing anything that can be computed. Right? And so, in principle, the human brain is this thing, right? In principle, the human brain is capable of computing anything if so properly trained. And so, an artificial general intelligence would be an AI system which is able to basically affect outcomes, add value in multiple domains. Right. Right now, we're living in an era of artificial narrow intelligence, meaning we can train AIs to become very versant in a very particular domain, but when we start moving them to other domains, they get brittle and they fall apart. And so an AGI would be able to basically have a very effective understanding of the world, would be able to reason, would be able to plan, would have persistent memory like us, and would be able to add value in multiple domains. And so there's a lot of technical breakthroughs that have not yet been achieved that we would need in order to get to AGI. So it's a question of how quickly are we going to achieve those technical breakthroughs. And so some like Dario Modi think it could be within 2 years we could be there. Demis Haspis thinks probably before the end of the decade. So I think it's we don't really know. All I do is what I can say with confidence is that AI over the next few years will become so powerful in particular domains that even though it may not have the AGI label, may not have that general capability, it'll have very advanced capabilities in specific domains, which will be enough to significantly disrupt, I think, the global economy.
And Matthew, one final follow-up question on this kind of this loop. Where do you see the geopolitical tension going in now with the race for AGI, with China, with the US? We already see so much disruption to the global economy. The political international system is fragmenting, and I anticipate that in our audience, is asking about this. They anticipate further fragmentation, further tension, with the stakes being so high. Are you optimistic that the Googles of the world, the Open AIs of the world, are going to arrive there first, or are you starting to see that, well, wow, when China mobilizes, when they get their researchers all in line, the US and the Western civilization is democratic. We have votes. We're participatory in that sense.
Well, I'm a lot less optimistic than I was 8 months ago. I've been absolutely kind of amazed how quickly China has I think caught up to almost parity algorithmically. That's been very impressive. I mean, some of their DeepSeek, which is not the government per se, that's just it's a particular AI lab. What they've been able to achieve algorithmically is almost at parity. Now that's not entirely true, but close enough. That's remarkable. I think that even some of the advances they made in chip manufacturing has been, I think everyone would agree, far ahead of what we predicted. We thought NVIDIA had at least a couple of years advantages. I think they've been trimming that down significantly. So that's an advantage that may soon be slipping away. And certainly when it comes to like the ability to get their hands on data, I mean, we're kind of bridled in the West in the sense that we have all these privacy laws and things which in some ways inhibit our companies from getting access to sufficient data to train more powerful models. And that China is just not inhibited in the same way, and especially if the government is going to be stepping in and supporting the labs in a very direct way, that could really accelerate their development. So I think at this point, I mean, if something doesn't change in the West, it's China's to lose at this point, which is remarkable because I think Google and is still very much I think the leader in this space. I think XAI, which is Elon Musk's company, has access to a lot of real world data through Teslas, which would be really important for training an AI with effective world models. So, but I just think China's acceleration is big. The one thing that they have going for them that I think is ultimately is going to lead them to have a strategic advantage, unless again something changes, is that they're really effective at manufacturing infrastructure. I mean, like specifically energy infrastructure. The ability, what they've been building over the past 10 years is incredible as far as energy capacity. And at the end of the day, having an AGI is great, but you need mass amounts of compute for people to run inference on it, to use the AI. And so, I mean, so if we get to AGI first, but we're constrained because we don't have the power to actually power our data centers, which will run this AI, and China has massive energy infrastructure 6 months behind us. In the end, they're going to get there, and because they have the infrastructure in place, that they're just going to be able to deploy it faster and ultimately win. So I think there's a lot of important hurdles, which is why the West needs to come together. And which is obviously not easy because the West is not exactly united right now. And so there's a pivotal role that the church has to play in saying, listen, this is something that, not to be adversarial towards China, but simply to say that it's important that the West and Western values, that we succeed in this kind of effort to create more and more powerful AIs, but to create more and more powerful AIs that are safe and are actually pointed and aligned with humanity, pointed at the right problems. I think in the end, like getting to AGI because we don't want China to get there first, maybe that's a strategic reality and we can't do anything about that. But I just don't think that the church that should be the goal, that should be the focus that the church is advocating for. It should be advocating for ensuring that AI is aligned with human beings and human flourishing.
Beautiful. And so we have a question here in terms of making sure that that the AI is aligned with human flourishing. So this is for you, Alessandro, and then there's also a follow-up for you, Matthew. There are two questions. So Alessandro, I'll start with you. What is a AI tool that does not exist yet, but that you are looking forward to in the next few months to a year that you would like to implement for the Hallow app? And then there's one like that for you, Matthew, as well, for Magisterium AI.
Yeah, for sure. I think this ties, maybe I can tie it in as a connection point to the last question that Matthew was wrestling with. I think one of the points of hope is that even in a world where many of the models have, let's say, absolute control in their incentive system, so whether it's private market companies or the Chinese companies with more state control, there are a number of models, and at least part of the community, especially Meta, maybe at the lead of this, have really embraced open source. And so I think I don't think AI is close to the example of like nuclear weapons where you can tightly control inputs as a way to control outputs with enriched uranium and other things. I think what you then want is a diffusion of access and innovation. And so I think there's some hope there in the open source community that maybe that's part of the answer of balancing kind of a crazy, unsafe solution. I think to that end, and connecting to Hallow, I think one of our beliefs or hopes of a possible positive future embracing AI is that where a lot of the value and focus ends up accruing is in vertical applications, or what might be called the application layer of AI, not the fundamental model of AI, where as opposed to AGI being the ultimate primary use case, more fine-tuned focused AIs that can really get to know a context really well. And I think I'd be curious to hear the other two perspectives on like probability distributions of where they think what is a more likely outcome at this point. But I think there's a fair amount of focus where, or possibility where AI becomes a computational reality. Mark Andreessen just came up with this, where he thinks AI is not the new phone, but is the new computer, right? Is a new computational framework, where the ultimate focus of the computation is different based on different cases, what might be called verticals. So for us, I think we think of AI along with many other types of computational algorithmic approaches, in addition to actual theology and content. I think for us, one of our most exciting near-term things is really being able to personalize a faith journey in a way that's meets you in your reality. So Matthew mentioned earlier, we really do have to meet people where they're at. That expression is used a lot in faith world. I think it's easy to say that, really hard to do that. Upwards of 50% of users coming into Hallow these days are non-Catholic, which is a huge focus of ours from an evangelization perspective and super exciting from a mission perspective. It presents some really hard realities where someone walking in the door may have never heard of Jesus before, or may not have ever heard of the catechism or something like that. It might be very much 101, is there a God? We have a lot of searchers that come into the app, as well as people coming in as faithful Catholics, priests, deacons, bishops, and looking for a deeper exegetical experience or something like that. And so the idea to really be in service of personalization is kind of a broad category of things we're excited about. And then enabling, like I said earlier at the beginning, that hand-in-hand journey of the formation of the heart, as well as the formation of kind of understanding of the catechetical realities of the church. So coming in and kind of the super extended version of the Netflix home screen, where everyone has a different home screen, but it looks very different for different people. I think something like that to really have a personalized guide to your spiritual life.
Fantastic. And then Matthew, with Magisterium AI, what down the horizon in terms of AI developments are you really excited about?
Well, I mean, I think education and catechesis is something I'm, excited about. I'm a convert to the faith, and I think in large part my conversion at least began as kind of intellectual conversion first. I think there's a lot of people out there, highly educated, who have a lot of important pressing questions on their minds, and they're just looking for someone they can sit down and ask those questions and get the really straight answers. And so I think, one of the cool things about AI is it's infinitely patient. And if you give it access to, a very large knowledge base, in principle, it should have answers to most of the profound questions that people are searching for. So we found that with Magisterium AI. And I think as we continue to grow our knowledge base and our mission to kind of digitize the patrimony of the church and make that available to everyone in the world for free, I think there'll be a lot more opportunities for ancient wisdom and insight to actually be brought to bear in people's lives in a way that could really be transformative. So I'm super excited about that. I think personalization is something else I'm also very excited about, where you can kind of figure out where someone's at and figure out what from the patrimony of the church could be brought to bear to help them kind of take that next step. But I think one of the big problems that we're being confronted with, and I think Hallow, we talked about this before, Alessandro, is off-ramping, right? I mean, meeting people where they're at, got to do it, right? We got to do it. And so people are using AIs, and if they come to us as an alternative because they want a straight faithful answer, great. But then at some point in that journey, what the next step is connecting them to a human being or a community, right? So how do we identify that moment? And then how do we effectively off-ramp them? And where do we off-ramp them? I mean, this is actually one of the biggest challenges we have right now. Is in the past, it was always just send them to the parish. Well, not every parish is ready for that, right? I mean, people may have a good experience. There could be a misalignment with the person in the actual parish, right? So I think this is something that I want to work with, like with platforms like Hallow, but also with the diocese. I was just recently in England, and we had some really interesting conversations with people there. There's some ministries that are actually being created right now to actually solve for this problem. There's one example was there's a phone line being set up in England with retired priests and retired catechists that people can call up if they're looking to ask some questions or connect with another human being. And I think that's really exciting. But what a great way to leverage the experience of our retired priests. So if we could identify when a person's ready to take the next step and direct them to something like that, and that becomes their first kind of connection to a human being in the faith, which hopefully then will connect them to a community. I think that's really exciting.
Beautiful. And here we have an interesting question. This is for you, Father Michael. So there's an interesting common thread that's developed on community and friendship, and saying that as AI continues to develop, they're going to become our best friends. And then there's a follow-up comment below saying, when are we going to be taking these AI systems to be baptized? Can you speak to the importance of real friendships, to how, to the moral status of digital minds, as we continue to enter into this digital world? And this will be our final question.
Yes, this is a fascinating topic. And I think that AI systems will only get better at mimicking, emulating, imitating a lot of the types of comments, even actions that we tend to associate with conscious human beings who have an interior life. But these AI systems lack that inner experience. They lack an emotional connection with users, though they may be trained and designed to give the kind of reactions or comments that we would associate with real people who actually have this emotional or intellectual, spiritual depth. It makes me think of the fact that already in this primitive primitive AI chatbot from Josef Weizenbaum called Eliza, the users very quickly found that they were attributing a lot of human characteristics, personal characteristics, to a very primitive system that was basically formed to imitate Carl Rogers' approach to psychology, which was focused on helping the client to articulate their own views rather than impose a kind of outside judgment. So for instance, the users of this primitive chatbot, Eliza, would say something like, "I'm feeling very sad today." And the bot could easily respond, "Why are you feeling sad today?" And it was an interesting exercise, and there can be a value to that. And we can grow in self-knowledge through bots like this, so long as we don't confuse them with human beings. But to the great chagrin of Weizenbaum, the designer, he found people quickly anthropomorphizing the systems as kind of confirmation that we tend to fill in the gaps. We see certain aspects that we associate with human beings, and we we mentally fill in the gaps and begin treating them more and more like human beings. So I think that there is already the reality of this companionship, and people who are convinced that they do have a deep friendship with different AI systems, which today obviously are much more sophisticated than ELIZA, and we'll continue to see that problem. But that perceived consciousness is not the same as an ontological consciousness. It's not the same of actually having a soul or having this interior, subjective, interpersonal experience of life in the world. And so these systems may be able to help us practice certain behaviors associated with friendship. I can think of people who, for one reason or another, because of trauma, because they're neurologically divergent, because they're going through a big transition in their life, they might want to seek out a kind of safe space in a sort of AI companion system, or a kind of AI mental health system, just to think through, talk through certain issues where they don't really feel judged, where they feel they can explore. But all of this ought to be a training ground so that people can better transition into the good stuff, into the interpersonal connection with real human beings. And anyone who's had a deep friendship knows that deep friendships are joyful. Deep friendships bring a lot of affirmation and encouragement. But good friends also call us out, and they challenge us, and they point out our limits and our faults and our flaws, or they just call us to bear patiently with the limits of another human being. And again, those who have been blessed to experience this kind of deep friendship know that, as painful and messy as it is, it's actually one of the most rewarding experiences in all of life. And it's where we so often grow in virtue. You know, it's interesting that the great master of virtue, Aristotle, the pre-Christian philosopher who wrote the first major systematic work of ethics, chose to devote whole books, or chapters, we might think of them today, whole chapters to his treatise on ethics as the pursuit of happiness, specifically to friendship. So this tendency toward isolation, toward individualism, is a deviation from ancient pre-Christian wisdom. And thankfully, we as Christians can take all of those legitimate human insights from Aristotle and actually elevate them, and appreciate the fact that not only can we have these sorts of challenging and enriching and affirming friendships with other human beings, but that we can actually have that kind of friendship with God. And that was a real revelation, and revolution based in revelation, right? There was the serious question: how could you be a friend of God? Because where friendship in the highest form demands a certain equality, a certain similarity, common goals, common pursuits, common capacities. And we're clearly at a distance from God as finite creatures. And yet Christian revelation brings that great truth that we are, through divine grace, through the gift of baptism, elevated and brought into, we're divinized, we're made like God. And that's a precious gift that enables us to enter into that similarity and that deep friendship with God. And the beautiful thing is, the deeper that friendship with God becomes, the better friends will be with other human beings made in the image and likeness of that perfect communion. So it's a mutually enriching dynamic, where the better we're friends with God, the better friends we can be to our neighbor, and the more caring and loving we are with other people. And love that also, as I said, involves sometimes challenging people and correcting them. The better we exercise that with our neighbor, the better equipped we will be to deepen in that relationship with God. So while I think, again, these AI systems can provide some aids, some helps in particular cases, they ought to be always well guided and directed toward real life interpersonal relationships, so that we can enter into deep communion with people who really do share interior experiences and have that intellectual, emotional, spiritual life that machines can emulate without possessing. And that is, I think, going to be a great path of happiness, and enable us to really navigate so many challenges that we're facing, and learn how to use these tools wisely.
Beautiful. Thank you, Father, for those wonderful closing comments. So that's all the time we have today. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Matthew, Father Michael, and Alessandro, for the very insightful conversation today. And this is a reminder for all of you who are watching online. We want to keep the conversation going, so be sure to follow and check in with us at Builders AI Forum online on social media. And also that on September 11th, we'll have a follow-up webinar on how the church can leverage AI. So thank you once again, and we'll see you all then.